This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, which gives you an insight into the real Scotland, its people, its customs and traditions, the amazing castles and palaces, battlefields and some beautiful landscapes of mountains, glens and deep freshwater lochs, such as Loch Ness and Loch Lomond. My intention is to take you on a virtual journey, sharing with you all that Scotland has to offer. And if you intend to visit this wonderful country at some stage in the future, then perhaps this tour might be shaped by some of what you discover here. Whatever way you intend to enjoy Scotland, then, I hope that by listening to this podcast and viewing my monthly video podcasts on my website, you get a feel for what this magical land of the Scots has to offer you. This podcast is the second in a tour trilogy that will take us from Portree on the island of Skye, with a tour around the beautiful Trotternish Ridge. In my last podcast, we travelled from Loch Ness to Portree, the capital of the Isle of Skye. As we left Loch Ness, we took the turning up Glen Morrison, past Loch Cluny, then on to Glen Shiel, and talked about the Battle of Glen Shiel of 1719. From there, we called into the most photographed castle in Scotland, Eilean Donan, before popping into the wonderful gardens at Attadale on the shores of Loch Carron. Then we crossed the Skye Bridge onto the island of Skye, or the Misty Isle as it's known, and as we crossed the bridge I let you into the secret of how a Norwegian princess used to reward passing ships after they had paid their toll fee, and how she became known as Saucy Mary. From there we continued up into the red and black Cullins, and took the most wonderful pictures of those iconic mountains at Sligacan Bridge. Finally we arrived at Portree, the capital of Skye, and rested for the night. Today we are going to head north and take in one of the two peninsulas, the Trotternish Ridge as it's called. We're going to see sites such as the Old Man of Storr, Kilt Rock, Flora Macdonald's resting place, Skye's Museum of Island Life and much more. Skye is one of the most popular islands to visit in Scotland, and I'm really excited to be telling you all about it. It's going to be a wonderful trip, so I'd now like you to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy the second part of your Unique Scotland tour from Loch Ness to Skye. If you're at home and enjoying a wee dram, then I raise my glass to you with the traditional Gaelic Scottish toast, Slanjava. Well, having arrived in Portree last night, it was good to have a wee rest before heading off into the town to find a good restaurant, and it was a super evening. I ate at the Cullin seafood restaurant, where I had scallops with black pudding, followed by a salmon dish which was superb. My guests ate at the Jacobite restaurant just around the corner from the main square of the town, and enjoyed some local lamb and a cranachan for dessert. And I explained cranachan in my podcast on customs and traditions for those wondering what it was. We actually met up after dinner and enjoyed a pint together at the Isles Inn, which is a pub on the main square. It has a great pub atmosphere and live music. Well, before we head north this morning, let me tell you a wee bit about Portree. Firstly, the name comes from Gaelic Portan Rye, which means King's Port, and is reputed to date from a visit by King James V of Scotland in 1540. Now, King James brought with him a fleet of warships in an attempt to persuade the island clans to support him. There will be a future podcast on the Stuart dynasty, so you'll learn much more of what happens during that period then. Well, Portree has about 1,500 inhabitants and is the largest town and effectively the capital of the island of Skye. As it happens, the village is only about 200 years old and was established as a fishing village by Lord Macdonald. There is a lovely picturesque harbour, and the pier was designed by Thomas Telford, who we heard about in a previous podcast on the building of the Caledonia Canal. There is a Gaelic heritage centre called the Aros Centre, which celebrates the island's Gaelic heritage. And talking of Gaelic, around 40% of the island's population speak Gaelic, probably the highest percentage among all the Western Isles. Only about 2% of Scotland's entire population speak the language, and that's not surprising as the major centres of population are found in the bigger cities such as Edinburgh and Glasgow, and very few people speak Gaelic down there. In the centre of the village is a busy central square, which becomes a tourist hotspot in the summer. There are some excellent restaurants in the town, and the ones that I normally frequent are the Cullin restaurant, which I ate at last night, and the sister restaurant Sea Breezes on the waterfront of the harbour. And if you look at the photo image on the podcast pages of my website, you'll be able to see the harbour with all the lovely painted buildings on the waterfront. The Royal Hotel is also on the main square, and this is the site of the old McNabb's Inn, and apparently is where Flora Macdonald met Bonnie Prince Charlie for the last time in 1746. She'd helped him escape from the clutches of the British Army after his bitter defeat at the Battle of Cullin. And I'll talk more of that later when we visit Flora's resting place at Kilmuir at the top of the island. The town of Portree has everything a visitor needs, with cafes, restaurants, banks and churches, and not necessarily in that order. There is also a daily bus service from Portree to Inverness and Glasgow. So as you can see, Portree is a bit of a hub, and it's not uncommon to meet fellow travellers and tour guides on their own journey across the island. It's particularly fun if you're visiting in the summer when the Skye Highland Games are on. I always take half a day out with my guests to attend that and have some fun watching the different competitions, including tossing the caber, the dancers, the kilt swirling and plenty bagpipes to listen to. Well, it's 9 a.m. and we'll soon be leaving Portree and get onto the road heading north onto the Trotternish Ridge, one of the two peninsulas in the north of Skye. The other one is called the Trotternish Peninsula, and we'll visit that later. Well, fed, watered and rested, we get into the car and head north on the single-track road, hugging the sea on the east side of the peninsula. And I really do mean single-track. On this road there is only enough space for one vehicle, so you have to do a sort of dance with other vehicles as you make your way along the road. There are passing places at regular intervals, but as cars come at you from the other direction, you have to stop and start to let each other pass. And this is one of the reasons that I smile when guests book a tour and give me a rough itinerary to follow. They've probably taken their timings from Google Maps, but in reality, on a single-track road, it really is necessary to add at least 15 to 30 minutes for every journey. Anyway, who wants to be going at speed when you have beautiful mountains and seascapes to look at? It's not long before the Trotternish Ridge comes into view. The best known feature of this ridge is the Trotternish landslip, which is a massive landslide that runs the full length of the peninsula for nearly 20 miles. If you can imagine a range of hills, nicely rounded, but one side has effectively collapsed, leaving a cliff-like face all the way up the peninsula, then this is the Trotternish Ridge. And what caused it was the building up of volcanic rock formed by the considerable weight of lava flows millions of years ago. That weight bearing down on the weaker sandstone underneath made one side of the hill collapse and give the cliff-type face we see today. And the ground in places is still moving slowly towards the sea. This landslip has created incredible rock features on the hillsides, resulting in some of the most picturesque landscape in Scotland, and we soon arrive at one of the most famous on Skye, the Old Man of Storr. And do look in my podcast page on the website to see some super photographs of this incredible pinnacle, part of the most photographed landscape in the world. Well, the Old Man is an extremely tall standing piece of rock that stands high up in an area called the Sanctuary and can be seen for miles. The Storr and other smaller pinnacles were created by the massive collapse and movement of the mountainside. You'll know you've arrived because there's a line of cars in the car park. It's a very popular walk from the road to the pinnacle, and covering a distance of about 2 miles, it will take about an hour and a quarter at a gentle pace up and back to the ridge. The Old Man himself is 160 feet high, and you probably won't appreciate the size until you're at the base of the pinnacle. Would I recommend climbing it? Certainly not without the right gear and experience anyway. As we get back on the road north, the ridge stands out in all its beauty on the left-hand side, while the Sound of Raasay is on our right with the Scottish mainland in the distance just on the horizon. On the scenic route taking us north, there are a few viewpoints, and it's possible to park the car and walk about 5 minutes before getting to the edge of the sea cliffs. But our first stop on the right is going to be Kilt Rock, overlooking the sea just by Loch Milt. There's a good car park by the edge of the cliffs, and you can walk to a viewpoint protected by railings to get a good look at a dramatic waterfall at this point. Kilt Rock comprises a spectacular sea cliff, about 180 feet tall, which is about 55 metres, and it's made of basalt with dolerite rock, giving it the appearance of different colours. The rock formations of vertical basalt columns seem to resemble the pleats of a kilt, thus the name Kilt Rock. In the car park, there is also a display of dinosaur footprints, and I know that sounds rather strange, but one of the advantages of land slippage over the millennia has been the discovery of fossilised dinosaur footprints in this locality. And we're fortunate because as we leave the car park to head north once more, we soon arrive at a lovely restored stone-built cottage which serves as the Staffin Dinosaur Museum. The great thing is that the museum was established by the owner Dugald Ross in 1976 when he was only a teenager, and he turned his passion for his hobby of collecting fossils off the local beach into an internationally acclaimed collection of dinosaur fossils. The museum is just off the road on the left-hand side, and as you drive north, it's a great place to stop and have a chat with Dougal about his passion. Our next stop will be at Staffin, down on the seashore, to look for actual dinosaur footprints, because this is where Dougal used to come when he was a young boy to find them himself. And a few moments later we arrive at the village of Staffin, the name of which comes from the Norse, place of pillared rocks, so perfectly named after Kilt Rock. Anyway, before I digress, we enter Staffin, take the turning to the beach at Corran, and follow the road that winds its way down to the sea. There's a signpost in the car park explaining that fossilised dinosaur footprints have been found on the shoreline, and when the tide is out, they can be seen. So it's out of the car, put on some sturdy non-slip footwear, and head down onto the rocks by the shore. The first time I visited, I didn't find any myself. On the second occasion I visited, my guests had 2 children, and their 12-year-old boy found the first footprint within minutes. And it was an exciting moment, for me as well. What we were looking at was a footprint left by an ornithopod, a herbivorous dinosaur that walked on 2 legs and made this footprint 160 million years ago. When you think that the Cullin Mountains were only formed about 60 million years ago, then this is an incredible find. There have been other finds all over the island, including the carnivorous Megalosaurus and the Stegosaurus, and this sort of adds to Skye's reputation as the dinosaur isle. Well, feeling very happy with ourselves that we'd found the elusive footprints, we continue north once more, and notice that the Trotternish ridge on the left is becoming more pronounced. 5 minutes later, we turn left away from the sea and head up into what is called the Quorang, continuing to climb up to almost 2,500 feet until we're right at the top, and we're among some of the most breathtaking views of the island. It is really quite extraordinary, and all caused by the collapse of the softer sandstone bedrock being crushed by the weight of the solidified volcanic basalt. This part of the ridge is actually still moving, although I'm glad to say at a rate that should not affect casual visitors. Although the road at the bottom has to be repaired every year because of the cracks that appear. The Quorang name comes from the Norse kvi rand, which means a round fold or pen, and originally it was a great place to hide cattle from invaders to the island. And whereas you have a rounded grassy slope on the west side of the mountain, the east side falls sharply away, leaving a set of cliffs. And you can just imagine the colossal upheaval thousands of years ago as this whole peninsula collapsed. It's a great place for photographs where the landform is so irregular, with bastions of rock raising their imposing forms into amazing shapes, with very appropriate names such as the castle, the tower and the needle, which rises to a height of 126 feet, or 39 metres. And if you look on the podcast page of my website, you can see some fabulous photographs of this imposing ridge just there. The Quorang itself is designated as a National Scenic Area, and you'll appreciate why when you either view the photos or perhaps come and see it for yourself. Well, we return by the single-track road that we took to come up, and at the road end we turn left and back onto the circular road around the peninsula. We continue north until we come to a settlement called Floddigary, where it's quite evident that the ground is subsiding. Indeed, quite regularly cracks appear in the road, and it's obvious that the ground is moving, and these have to be repaired every year. From the road can be seen the Floddigary Hotel, a fabulous boutique hotel with exquisite dining experience, and what a location for sea views. Such a romantic spot. Well, we're going to take the road down to see it, but it's not the hotel I wish to talk about this time, but the small building to the rear of the hotel, which was the first home of Flora Macdonald, a lady I have mentioned in previous podcasts who helped Bonnie Prince Charlie, the leader of the Jacobites, to escape, and I'll be talking about her shortly when we visit her grave. Well, just behind the hotel is a beautiful little cottage where Flora and her husband Alan spent about 20 years of their married life. It really is a quaint abode, and the last time I visited there was a lovely border of flowers and hanging baskets to give the cottage a feeling of warm and friendly home. As it happens, the cottage is now annexed to the hotel with 7 beautifully adorned rooms, and each room has been named after one of Flora and Alan's 7 children. Well, having viewed the cottage, we get back on the road and continue heading north. We are just about to arrive at the very top of the peninsula, and as we come around, with the expansive sea called the North Minch on our right-hand side, we can see in the distance, on the horizon, the island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. Fabulous sight, and with blue skies above and a fresh breeze blowing in from the sea, it's a pleasure to stop for a few moments and enjoy the wonderful scenery. Well, I do hope you're enjoying the trip just as we come over the top of the Trotternish Peninsula. And as we drive on, we enter the settlement of Duntulm, which is Gaelic for fort on the grassy hillock, or fort on the cliff. And sure enough, a ruined castle comes into view on our right-hand side. It appears to be hanging onto the cliffs for dear life, and although there's only a couple of walls and stones strewn across the area, it's obvious that this was once a strong bastion, strategically built on a cliff edge to make a statement. We drive down and park the car, and we can walk across a well-made path and grassy bank towards the cliffs, and the ruin comes into full view. You've got to take good note of the safety notice at this point, which states, "For your safety, you're advised not to proceed beyond the castle fence line," and a further sign at the castle end of the path reinforces this message. It is a sign to be heeded, as there is a considerable drop onto the rocks below if you slip. So this is the ruin of Duntulm Castle, and it has quite a history. The original fortress on this site was apparently a Pictish castle, and that formed one of many forts stretching along the island's coast to give protection and warning of approaching enemies from the sea. The one enemy that could not be repelled, however, was the Viking, and this fort was taken and became the residence of a powerful Viking leader who gave it the name David's Fort. When the Vikings were eventually defeated in the 13th century, and Scotland became united under one king, the Trotternish Ridge was embroiled in a power struggle between the Norse lords, who became the powerful clans of MacDonald and MacLeod, and the castle changed hands several times. In the 16th century, the MacDonalds, who became lords of the Isles, took complete control and retained the castle until the 18th century, before moving on to more comfortable accommodation elsewhere. There are 2 ghost stories around this castle, and one particularly sad. The first story is of a chieftain's brother, who is said to roam the ruins wailing about his misfortune and stupidity. The story goes that he was jealous of his brother, the chief of the clan, and wanted to take power for himself. So he sent 2 letters, one to his brother, the chief, inviting him to dinner. The second letter was to an assassin to come to the castle that night to kill the chief. Unfortunately for him, the letters got mixed up, and when the chief realised what his brother had intended, he had him arrested and thrown into the castle dungeon, where he was fed salted beef but given no water. The poor man went mad and died, and his ghost still roams Duntulm Castle ruins today. The second ghost story is of a young woman, nanny to the children of the chief. She was in the nursery one day, which was to be found high up in the castle, and spied out of the window the chief returning from a trip. She told the young boy that she was caring for, and he begged to be able to see his father and asked to be picked up so that he could wave to him. She picked the child up, and as she approached the window, she tripped, losing grip of the boy, who fell forward out of the window and dropped to his death on the courtyard cobbles below, watched by the horrified chief and father. Sadly for the nanny, punishment was swift, and her ghostly figure still wanders the ruined castle to this day. Well, we must leave these sad tales behind and continue around the peninsula to a favourite place of mine, and that is the Skye Museum of Island Life, which we find near the settlement of Kilmuir. Now, whenever you say Kill, K-I-L, or Chill, C-I-L, in front of a word, that's Gaelic for church or sacred place. And in this case, the Muir stands for Mary, so in fact the village is called the Church of Mary. The museum is in the form of an old village, which has retained its historic charm. And one could imagine being back in the 17th century and coming across this small township of very sturdy, stone-built, thatched roof cottages constructed to serve a small community of islanders. There are a number of cottages, some original and others reconstructed to show the type of workings that would have been available to this small community. In the Highlands and Islands today, there are very few old-fashioned thatched cottages, so it's a privilege to experience a community of such authenticity. Only 50 to 100 years ago, thatched houses such as these would have been the norm on the island, and the peat would have been the main source of heat and light on the long winter nights. Perhaps the light would have been supplemented by a lamp burning fish liver oil. The cottage was normally built of stone, walls up to 3 feet thick, short in height and stocky in build, and the gable end or the end of the house, facing the prevailing wind, would be rounded, almost aerodynamic, to cope with the irregular gales of the Western Isles. The roofs would be hip-ended with overhanging eaves of thatch which formed a fringe around the top of the wall. And before the plantation of conifers on the island, there were very few trees, and the locals would have depended upon driftwood for their rafters, or perhaps wood from shipwrecks on the dangerous reefs surrounding the coast. I do recall a story, not from the Isle of Skye, I hasten to add, but from another Scottish island where the locals had done everything to stop the building of a lighthouse at the tip of their island because they depended so much on driftwood from stricken ships. Just a wee bit selfish, I feel. Anyway, the stone cottages we find here are of varying age. The first ones to visit are the Crofter's House and the Cayley House, which date from the 19th century, whereas the others are more recent builds to give a good idea as to the facilities available in a community such as this. So what would you find inside? Well, as you go in the door, and you'd have to bow down if you're taller than 5 feet or 1.5 metres, and you'd find 2 rooms. On the right is the family room, which consisted of a living or a sitting room, which was also the kitchen, where all meals were cooked, served and eaten by the family. They would also relax here during the evening. The other room was the bedroom, with boxed beds being the norm. So with families of between 8 to 12 people, it got a little crowded. And with only 2 rooms, I'm often asked by my guests how these people survived in such a tiny space. Well, firstly, it was compact, and with the walls 3 feet thick, this ensured that the essential warmth was kept in. Yes, it was cosy, but it has to be remembered that a lot of space was not required, because nearly every daylight hour the family would be out working on the croft to grow enough food for the summer and also stockpiling for the winter. The bottom line was that if not enough food was produced, they starved. Simple as that. It was a way of life, and personal space was not necessarily a priority in those days. So how did they spend the long, dark winter nights? Well, I mentioned the word Cayley in my podcast on customs and traditions, and this Gaelic word means a gathering or social event, with singing, traditional music and storytelling, which in itself was hugely important to pass down clan history and also hear about the news of the day. And it is still a custom, when visiting Highlands and island communities, to be welcomed in and have a blether, which is a Scottish word for a chat. You have a good blether, as your hosts would be interested to hear your story, where you're from and what's going on in your part of the world. Well, just by standing in one of these small cottages do you get a real feeling of what it would have been like on a dark winter's night as the family of your neighbours crammed into the Cayley cottage to perform or listen to the traditional stories and songs. No Highland cottage was complete without some musical instrument, and most children were taught to use them from an early age. When I visit the islands today, I'm still amazed at how many children can play these musical instruments today, or sing, and they've got no difficulty at all in performing at a Cayley in the local village hall. And here is a taste of some local Highland music from just such a Cayley. Well, as we leave the museum, which is always popular with my guests, we can see up on the hill a large Celtic cross just beyond a new cemetery. This is the gravestone of Flora Macdonald, who I promised to tell you about earlier. We take a drive up, and beyond the new cemetery is the old one, and we step back a few hundred years as we go through the gates. Flora Macdonald is famous in Scotland today because of a selfless act of protecting and helping a young man escape the clutches of the British Army, who had put a huge sum on his head. The young man in question was Charles Edward Stuart, or as he was known, Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the young pretender to the throne of Great Britain. Charlie had grown up in Italy and would have been told tales of how his grandfather, James VII of Great Britain, had his crown stolen from him by William of Orange and had to go into exile in Italy, a Catholic country that offered him sanctuary. Now this was in 1689, and Charles's own father, James VIII, had tried to return to regain the throne in 1715 but failed. So Bonnie Prince Charlie arrived on Scottish soil in 1745, 30 years later, in an attempt to take back the throne for his father, and subsequently himself as a future king. The whole story will be given in a future podcast on the Jacobites, but for the time being, it's enough to give you the gist of Flora Macdonald's part in this tale. Now, Charlie had landed at Eriskay, a small island off the Outer Hebrides, in 1745, and having gathered some support for an uprising, headed to Edinburgh, then marched down south to London. His attempt to enter London was thwarted, so he retreated back to Scotland where, almost 1 year later in 1746, his Jacobite army faced the might of the British Army. It was a complete rout of the Jacobites, and Bonnie Prince Charlie fled, ending up hiding in the Outer Hebrides. Now, Flora Macdonald was visiting at the time and, through a relative, was introduced to the prince and agreed to help him escape from the British soldiers who were hunting for him. Flora obtained passes for herself and 2 personal servants to take a boat from Benbecula in the Outer Hebrides to Skye, and she dressed Bonnie Prince Charlie as her maid, Betty Burke. They made it to Skye and remained at the house of a Macdonald from Kingsborough, and Flora would later go on to marry the son of the owner. Bonnie Prince Charlie stayed for a short time, then carried on to the island of Rassay, and subsequently escaped back to France and home to Italy. The story takes quite a turn at this point because 2 weeks later the boatmen who took Flora and Charlie across the sea to Skye were detained and were forced to tell their jailers of the part that Flora had played in assisting the prince to escape. She was arrested immediately, taken to London and imprisoned in the Tower. She was lucky to escape with her life and released after the Act of Indemnity was passed in June of 1747. She did meet the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Cumberland, who commanded the British troops at Culloden, and he asked her why she'd helped Bonnie Prince Charlie. Her honest answer was that had the Duke of Cumberland been in a similar position, she would have done the same for him. When she returned to Skye, she met and married Alan MacDonald of Kingsborough, and should have settled down to a quiet life, but her new husband was an army officer, and they emigrated to North Carolina in 1774. Of course, to my American listeners, you'll know what happened 1 year later in 1775, the American War of Independence. Well, Alan, her husband, was caught right in the middle of it. He was captured at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge and spent 18 months in jail. The happy ending is that they both eventually returned to Skye and spent the remainder of their lives with their 7 children at Floddigary that we passed recently. The monument we stand before now in Kilmuir Cemetery is a very tall Celtic cross, and clearly not the first cross, as the head of an original cross lies in the grass just below the grave, blown down probably in a storm a few years ago. Flora died in 1790 at the age of 68, and Alan, her husband, some 4 years later. They had 7 surviving children. The inscription on the headstone seems to sum up this brave and uncompromising woman, which reads, "The preserver of Prince Charles Edward Stuart." Also on the cross is shown an epitaph written by a famous English author, Samuel Johnson, who had met Flora. It says, "Her name will be mentioned in history, and if courage and fidelity be virtues, mentioned with honour." It's said that there were 3,000 mourners at her graveside, and there were 300 gallons of whisky drunk afterwards. It's also said that her shroud was made of a sheet in which Bonnie Prince Charlie had slept. Lovely stories, whatever the truth. Well, before leaving this ancient graveyard, there's one other grave marker which is worth visiting, and that is the grave of Charles MacArthur, the last hereditary piper to the Macdonalds of Duntulm Castle that I mentioned earlier. and the inscription reads as follows: "Here lie the remains of Charles MacArthur, whose fame as an honest man and remarkable piper will survive this generation, for his manners were easy and regular, and his music and the melody of his fingers will—" And then the inscription ends suddenly, leaving half of the gravestone blank under the wording. Well, it is believed that the stone was commissioned by MacArthur's son, who sadly died in a drowning accident soon after commissioning the headstone. It would appear that the stonemason, thinking that the stone would therefore not be paid for, stopped at that point and didn't finish the wording on the gravestone. Sadly, it's not known what the rest of the stone should have said, but from the initial wording, I'm sure it would have been very complimentary. Well, we leave the old cemetery to drive down to the main road, and on the right-hand side we pass the new cemetery, and one large standing headstone with pronounced writing stands out, and this is the headstone of Lee Alexander McQueen, 1969 to 2010. For those that do not know him, he was an icon of the British fashion designer world, and chief designer at Givenchy from 1996 until 2010. Sadly, he took his own life and shortened what was a brilliant career in the fashion design world. Although he was born in London, his family came from Skye, and it was his final wish to have his ashes scattered here, and his wish was fulfilled. He could not have been laid to rest in a more beautiful location. High up, with the view from this spot is superb, and looks right out onto the sea and the Outer Hebrides beyond. Well, we continue south on the peninsula once more, and soon arrive down a very steep winding road into the port of Uig. The name is thought to be derived from Norse, which means inlet or bay, and describes this harbour very well. The ferry from here runs to the Outer Hebrides, connecting Skye with Tarbert on Harris and Loch Maddie on North Uist. As we continue to make our way up the hill, away from the harbour, and with the sea still on our right-hand side, we come across an amazing round tower, which is known locally as Captain Fraser's Folly. It was built about 1860 by Major William Fraser, who owned the Kilmuir estate, and was used as a place where local tenants had to go to pay their rents. Just opposite the monument is a place I usually stop for lunch on my tours, and it's the Uig Hotel, who do super lunches, and the seats in the bay window, if you can nab one, give super views over Uig Bay. Well, before we leave the Trotternish Ridge and head over to the Waternish Ridge, we will make a quick stop on the way south at the settlement of Kingsborough. This, you may remember, was the home of Flora's father-in-law. I visited the house some years ago, and it was falling into disrepair then. It's in private grounds and is behind a new house, so there's no possibility of gaining access. Well, as we head south again, we come to a break in the road, and if we continued on, we'd be back in Portree. But when we get to a small settlement called Carbost, we turn right and head west towards the Waternish Peninsula. After a few miles, we arrive at our overnight stop, the lovely Skibost Hotel, which is also a favourite stop for lunch if I'm passing this way late morning or early afternoon. This is a peach of a small hotel and sits in a beautiful location on the shores of Loch Snizort. The name is Norse and means the sheltered house, and although the present house dates from 1871, there has been some sort of residence here since Viking times. The interior is superb, with a huge lounge for guests to relax, as well as a very comforting log fire on those chillier evenings. The original house had its own chapel, and there is some stunning stained glass to be seen in what is now a private dining room. I also love the large, bright and airy conservatory to have lunch where you can sit and enjoy the view of the loch across the hotel's private golf course. It also boasts excellent salmon and trout fishing from the fast-flowing river of Snizort which runs through the grounds. Well, as we settle in for a relaxing evening with an excellent dinner to look forward to, we reflect on what has been a packed agenda for the day. From the village of Portree, the island's capital, up the east coast of the Trotternish Peninsula, to see the famous Kilt Rock and hear about the dinosaurs who roamed Skye hundreds of millions of years ago. We stood on what is probably one of the most beautiful ridges in Scotland and took in the beauty of the surrounding land formations that looks down across the sea to the distant mainland. We heard of the feats of Flora Macdonald, and there's more to come tomorrow when we visit Dunvegan Castle, the stronghold of the MacLeods. And talking of MacLeods, they have a fascinating history, and their castle at Dunvegan has been the ancestral home to MacLeod chiefs for nearly 800 years. We'll hear stories of a strange connection with fairies and how that connection has spurred on MacLeod warriors of the past to great victories. We'll visit the Fairy Bridge, the Fairy Glen, and the Fairy Pools. And even if you're sceptical about these mythical creatures, I think you'll find it interesting to hear how in times past they were very much part of the fabric of medieval society. We will also visit the Talisker Distillery and continue south, ending up at Kinloch Lodge Hotel to rest for the night, before taking the ferry back to the mainland the following day. With the bridge in the north and the ferry in the south, I love to use one to arrive and the other to leave the island. I just feel it's good to have had the true sense of being on a Scottish island, so taking the ferry in one direction is, to my mind, highly recommended. Well, I'm very much looking forward to the trip tomorrow, and I also look forward to you joining me on that journey. Don't forget that if you are listening to this from one of the streaming outlets other than through my website, you can also go to the podcast page of the website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk to see associated photographs of the trip. And I have to say, some of the Korang photos in particular are superb. Well, wherever you are in the world, I wish you well and hope you will join me next week for the final part 3 of this tour trilogy around Skye. It's always good to hear from people from around the world, so don't be shy. Drop me a line. It's john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk and let me know what you particularly enjoyed on our journey. If you've any preferences for future podcasts, I'd love to hear your ideas. So in the meantime, wherever you are in the world, I raise my glass to you and give you the Gaelic cheer, Slán Java.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.